Edward Lucas, as always, welcome. Thank you for joining me. Give me your thoughts on this, Edward, if you would. We had Putin in recent days publicly acknowledging that there is a problem caused by Ukraine and its drone strikes in particular. That public acknowledgement, is that significant, Edward? Give me your view on that. Does it mean that he's very clearly rattled now?
Putin's in a real bind because the Russians are rattled, and Russian social media is full now of clips of people having meltdowns in queues outside petrol stations which don't have anything to sell or don't have enough to sell. And if Putin pretends that everything is okay, then he's widening the gulf between him and what the Russian public perceives as reality. But if he admits, as he has done, that there are some difficulties, then it's giving the lie to his idea that everything's going well and the special military operation, as he calls the onslaught on Ukraine, is just a matter of time. So he's between a rock and a hard place. I think he's chosen the hard place. And this is not the first of, I think, many painful dilemmas that he'll face in the days and weeks ahead.
So what then are the options available to Putin faced with that, increasingly public show of discontent among the Russian people? The war is difficult now, far more difficult than it was. What can he do? What can he hope to do?
Well, I think all his options are bad, but he still has options. The first of them is to intensify, which means cranking up the conscription screw and maybe going towards a full mobilization. It means doing even more damage to the economy, cranking up the repression, and that could buy him some more time, although it comes at a cost. Another is to intensify the war and escalate, as they say, vertically, using new and more destructive weapons, possibly, again, a bit of nuclear saber rattling. Again, that's not great because, first of all, he's played that card already and it didn't work, and secondly, the Chinese hate it. And the third is to escalate horizontally, try and open another front, perhaps with some stunt against some other country, which could be Georgia, could be Kazakhstan, could even be a NATO country. And I think of the three, that's the most likely. And what he'll be hoping to do is to make people think, gosh, this war in Ukraine is quite dangerous for us too. And perhaps we better ask the Ukrainians to tone it down a bit. I don't think that will work, but I think it may be worth a shot for him.
Okay, that's a really interesting argument. I mean, think a bit further for us on how widening the front of tension and conflict serves Putin's interests, because Russia's stressed and strained as it is, and it can carry on with crypto, with cyber attacks and that kind of thing. It can seek to cut undersea cables and so on. But how does that directly benefit Putin and alleviate the kind of pressure he's under now?
Well, I think it benefits him in several ways, although I do think the costs are even greater. But it's saying to the Russian public, the Ukrainians are only doing so well because those beastly NATO countries are supporting them, and now we're giving NATO a taste of its own medicine. So it has a sort of propaganda effect at home, and Russians believe that they are at war not just with Ukraine, but also with NATO. So that sort of fits into that. I think the second, perhaps more important thing, is that it means that he can try and drive a wedge between Ukraine and its Western supporters. So if we have very serious cyber attacks, for example, or damage to infrastructure, there will be people in Western countries, not least in Britain, who will say, hang on a moment, why are we suffering all this pain with hospitals disabled, trains not running, airports closed, maybe even more physical sabotage with people being beaten up or things being burnt down or whatever. And this is the price we're paying for Ukraine, which is a war in a faraway country of which we know nothing and would like to know less, to paraphrase Neville Chamberlain. Now, I don't think that will work, but there's a chance it will, and it may not work in Britain, but it might work in some other countries. So playing divide and rule in the West, upping the ante, perhaps also highlighting the fact that if he attacks European countries, that America doesn't rally to their defense. Possibly even we get a message from Trump saying, well, isn't it time we ended this war and you should put pressure on Ukraine to do a deal? So there's a number of moving parts, or at least loose parts in the equation when you go further west in Ukraine, which give him a little bit of leeway.
Right. So the stiffening of Ukraine resistance just means that NATO and the West needs to raise its guard still higher and still more strongly. And
Absolutely. And also be aware that there may be provocations dressed up as false flags. And Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, has just been speaking about the how Hitler started World War II, which was with what looked like an attack on Nazi Germany by Poles. In fact, they were political prisoners who'd been dressed up in Polish uniforms and then shot. But it was called the Gleiwitz provocation, or Gliwice in Polish. And Radek is worried that there'll be some sort of attack where Putin will be able to say, this was NATO, and now I'm going to punish the NATO country responsible.
Right, and I suppose this warning, this lesson to NATO and the West, it also needs to take into account Crimea, doesn't it? Crimea in a state of emergency. Crimea suffered the loss of utilities and services, and Crimea has this enormous psychological, historical value to Putin. You wonder, will this just the pressure on Crimea, will that lead or make more likely some sort of huge escalation on Putin's side?
I think this is the sharpest of all the dilemmas that Putin faces. Russia is a very big place, and the Ukrainians, he can't defend everywhere, but the Ukrainians can't hit everywhere. But Crimea is the trophy of the war. It's the thing that sent Russians out in the street dancing when he seized it in 2014. And if the Ukrainians continue with their very successful operation of making it basically uninhabitable, no food, no water, no fuel, no power, no nothing, and Russians fleeing Crimea because it's become so horrible to live there, then that is a really serious problem for Putin, because he then has to neglect everything else, neglect all the rest of the front where Russians mostly not doing very well, and hurl troops into, and particularly air defenses into Crimea to try and protect it. Or he has to accept that this great trophy has turned into a hostage, and that through Crimea, the Ukrainians have their thumbs on his neck. The Russians have got the Ukrainians have got their thumbs on Putin's neck with the Crimea, and that's a very powerful tactic. And there's no easy way out for Putin on that. And I think we will see the Ukrainians pushing their advantage home very hard. The interesting thing is whether they will then come under pressure from the West, with the West saying, "Look, you're ahead. Quit while you're ahead." Get the best deal you can, and there'll be many in Ukraine who will say, no, we want to keep going, and that may also provide some daylight that Putin can work on.
All of this does raise some difficult questions for NATO, doesn't it? When they get to the Ankara summit quite soon, they can be sure that Donald Trump is going to put much more pressure on NATO members to up their spending on defence. That would include Britain, and maybe in one way he will have a point, given all that we're seeing and all that you are saying. And we have the British government now with, it seems, an increase in spending, planned of £13.5 billion. That's going to go up to maybe 14.5, maybe 15 billion. It all just seems so off the pace, doesn't it, Edward?
You're absolutely right, and Britain will go to the NATO summit with its trousers around its ankles, in disgrace, really. And there are very few. I mean, we're bring up the rear along with military lightweights like Belgium and Luxembourg and Portugal, in just not nearly spending enough. Now, the paradox in NATO is the countries that most need the United States are the ones that are really spending the most. And yet this doesn't spare them reliably from the wrath of Trump. And so Hegseth and Trump himself, Vance and the others are quite willing to take swipes even at their loyal and effective allies. But I think that Britain's going to come in for a grilling on this. They already don't like the fact that we have a Labour government. They don't like our digital services tax. They don't like what they see as a sort of tide of wokery and other things eroding the sort of slightly sentimental sort of Jeeves and Worcester idyll that they think should be the norm in Britain. And so I think that Starmer's going to come in for a spanking. And but the bigger question is not the theatrics directed against Starmer and the other laggards. The bigger question is, can NATO still count on the United States in the event of a crisis? And I'm afraid there is a question mark over that now.